Welcome to your deep dive. Today, we're turning back the clock
Oh,
to
wow.
1991, a year where the world was abuzz with sustainable development. But as you'll see, that meant very different things to different people,
Yeah,
especially indigenous communities who were really starting to find their voices on like a global scale.
that's right. And what makes this period so pivotal is that, indigenous peoples were no longer simply reacting to policies imposed upon them.
Right.
They were actively shaping the conversation around development, asserting their rights, and leading the charge for self-determination.
Yeah, and speaking of shaping the conversation, our guide for this journey is the IWGIA yearbook.
Okay.
From 1991, this document is a treasure trove of firsthand accounts from indigenous leaders and organizations
Wow.
worldwide.
So cool. The IWGIA played such a vital role back then, acting as a central hub, connecting these groups, advocating for their rights, conducting research, and amplifying their voices to the world.
So it's not just theory we're talking about here, it's real stories from the front lines.
Yeah.
And speaking of front lines, the yearbook reveals that a global movement for indigenous rights was taking shape. IWGIA was deeply involved, for instance, in exposing human rights violations against the Chittagong Hill Tracts peoples in Bangladesh.
Oh, wow.
Their report, Land is Not Ours, really shone a light on this issue.
Yeah. And in Europe, IWGIA was instrumental in forming the European Alliance for Indigenous Peoples.
Really?
Imagine advocating for indigenous rights within the European Economic Community.
Wow. Now here's where things get really thought-provoking. Sustainable development was the buzzword of the early 90s,
Right.
but the yearbook uncovers a lot of tension around what that actually meant for indigenous communities.
Absolutely. For many indigenous peoples, development often translated to exploitation and destruction of their lands and cultures.
It's like they almost had to redefine it for themselves.
Yeah. Take the Yanomami people in Brazil. The yearbook highlights the devastating impact of gold mining on their territory.
Thousands of miners just invading their land.
It's exactly polluting their water, spreading diseases, disrupting their entire social structure.
Oh, wow.
It's a stark contrast to, say, the Shipibo people in Peru, who the yearbook also profiles.
Now, they had something special going on, right?
For generations, they've been practicing a sophisticated system of self-sustaining development, managing their resources in harmony with nature.
It's beautiful.
It really makes you question whose definition of sustainable we're even talking about.
That's such a good point. And it leads us to what is, for so many indigenous peoples, the absolute bedrock of existence, land rights. The yearbook hammers home how fundamental land is to their identity, spirituality, and survival.
And if we zoom out to the bigger picture, control over land is intrinsically linked to self-determination, the very ability to control one's future.
The yearbook is packed with examples of this struggle for control. For instance, there's a fascinating account of the land titling project in Peru, a groundbreaking effort led by an indigenous organization to secure legal recognition of their territories. Imagine the courage that took back then.
Pioneering work, absolutely. But the fight for indigenous rights wasn't just about sustainable development or even land itself. It was, and in many ways still is, a fight against colonialism, both the legacies of the past and new forms of exploitation.
It's almost like a constant push and pull, isn't it?
Precisely. And the yearbook doesn't shy away from documenting this struggle. The Innu people in Canada protesting against military exercises on their traditional lands, the ongoing fight for Hawaiian sovereignty, the heartbreaking resistance of the West Papuan people against Indonesian control. These are just a few of the stories that jumped out at me.
These stories paint such a vivid picture of resilience, but it makes you wonder, how did indigenous communities hold on to their cultures amidst all this?
That's where the importance of cultural survival comes in. Language education and access to media are all vital for preserving those cultures and passing them down through generations.
The yearbook spotlights some inspiring examples. Take the Kahunga Rio, or language nests in New Zealand.
Yeah.
They were revitalizing the Maori language through early childhood education.
And then there's the establishment of a daily television news broadcast in Greenlandic. A huge step in promoting communication and information sharing in their native language.
Amidst all these challenges, you start to see these glimmers of hope, these signs that indigenous peoples were finding ways to take control of their own destinies.
One that really caught my eye was the proposal for an Indian parliament in Ecuador, a bold step towards greater political autonomy.
Wow. What else stood out?
Well, in the Philippines, the Aida people claiming Clark Air Base as their ancestral domain after the U.S. military withdrew, that was a powerful symbol of reclaiming what was rightfully theirs.
It's incredible to think that all of this was happening leading up to 1992, a year that marked 500 years since Columbus's arrival in the Americas.
Exactly. And as the yearbook makes clear, this was not a time for celebration, but for reflection, resistance, and a call for justice.
This wasn't just a local movement either. Indigenous peoples from all over the world gathered in Paris to issue a powerful declaration outlining their demands for recognition, self-determination, and an end to exploitation.
The Paris Declaration, a truly landmark moment showcasing the growing strength and unity of a global indigenous rights movement.
Now, the yearbook also delves into some really complex issues around resource management,
Okay.
particularly what are called common property regimes. To be honest, I wasn't entirely clear on how those worked.
Think of it like this. Imagine a community garden. Everyone shares the responsibility of caring for it, and everyone benefits from the harvest.
Okay.
That's the basic idea behind common property regimes. Resources like forests, fisheries, or grazing lands are managed collectively, not owned privately.
Ah, that makes sense. So what's the significance for indigenous communities?
These regimes are often deeply intertwined with their cultural practices, traditional knowledge, and sustainable ways of life.
Mhm.
The yearbook highlights both the benefits and the challenges they face, particularly in a world that often prioritizes individual ownership and profit.
The debate over whaling, for instance, is a perfect example. The yearbook presents contrasting perspectives, the scientific evidence for sustainable harvest versus the emotional and symbolic power of whale conservation.
It's a classic example of how managing shared resources can involve navigating competing values and interests.
Another fascinating example the yearbook spotlights is the Kempe Fire program in Zimbabwe.
Ah, yes. A community-based approach to managing wildlife resources. It really challenged the traditional top-down conservation model and demonstrated the potential for local communities to protect both nature and their own livelihoods.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, but I'm already seeing how the IWGIA yearbook from 1991 offers us a window into this incredibly complex and dynamic period for Indigenous peoples worldwide. It's like a snapshot of a turning point in history.
It really is. Welcome back to our deep dive into Indigenous peoples' rights and development in the 1990s. As we saw in Part 1, the IWGIA Yearbook 1991 provided a snapshot of a world grappling with the complexities of sustainable development and self-determination with Indigenous peoples at the heart of these discussions.
You know, as we've been unpacking this yearbook, one thing that's really struck me is the sheer diversity of Indigenous experiences across the globe. We're hearing from the Arctic to the Amazon, from the Pacific Islands to the plains of North America.
It's a powerful reminder that there's no single Indigenous experience. Each community has its own unique history, culture, and set of challenges.
Yet there are also these common threads that connect their struggles, especially when it comes to the fight for land rights, self-governance, and cultural survival.
Absolutely. And those common threads are woven through many of the environmental threats facing Indigenous communities that the yearbook highlights. Remember the devastating impact of gold mining on the Yanomami people in Brazil.
It's hard to forget.
Well, sadly, that's just one example. Pollution, deforestation, and large-scale development projects were major concerns back then, and they continue to be so today. In Canada, the Lubicon Lake Cree were and still are struggling with the impacts of oil and gas exploration on their territory.
It's almost like their land is being carved up against their will.
Their land is being crisscrossed by pipelines and roads, and they're seeing the degradation of their hunting and fishing grounds. And then in the Pacific, there were growing fears about the environmental and health impacts of nuclear testing, waste disposal, and even proposals to dump hazardous materials on some of the islands.
It's a stark reminder that Indigenous peoples are often on the front lines of environmental destruction. It makes sense when you think about it. Their livelihoods and cultures are directly tied to the health of the land and water.
Precisely. So when those ecosystems are damaged, they're the ones who bear the brunt of the consequences.
The yearbook doesn't shy away from the darker side of the fight for Indigenous rights either. It's not all about sustainable development and cultural preservation. We see instances of violence, repression, and just straight-up discrimination.
It's a sobering reality. The situation in Guatemala, for example, was particularly grim in 1991. The country was in the midst of a long and brutal civil war, and Indigenous communities were caught in the crossfire.
It's hard to even imagine.
There were widespread reports of massacres, forced displacement, and human rights abuses. And in East Timor, the Indonesian military was cracking down on any signs of dissent or calls for independence. The Santa Cruz massacre, which happened just a year after the yearbook was published, is a horrific example of the brutality that the Timorese people were facing.
These stories are so difficult to hear, but they highlight the fact that the struggle for Indigenous rights can be incredibly dangerous even deadly.
Yes, and yet amidst these immense challenges, the yearbook also showcases the resilience and determination of Indigenous communities. They were organizing, mobilizing, and finding creative ways to resist oppression and assert their rights.
It's inspiring to see how they didn't let those challenges break them. What were some of the ways they were fighting back?
One of the things that stands out is the growing sophistication of Indigenous activism. They were using legal strategies, engaging with international bodies like the United Nations, and forming alliances with other social justice movements.
So it was becoming more strategic and organized.
Exactly. For instance, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Maoris were making significant strides in reclaiming their language and culture. The Kahongareo movement, those language nests we talked about, was gaining momentum. There was also a growing push for the recognition of the Treaty of Waitangi, which had been signed over 150 years earlier, but had been largely ignored by the government.
Wow, over 150 years. That's a long time to be fighting for recognition.
It speaks to the persistence and determination of the Maori people. And in the United States, the American Indian movement AIM was continuing its fight for treaty rights, self-determination, and an end to discrimination. They were also leading the way in reclaiming sacred sites and raising awareness about the historical injustices that Native Americans had faced.
It's amazing how these movements were happening all over the world. It really does highlight the interconnectedness of Indigenous struggles.
Absolutely. And speaking of interconnectedness, one thing that really struck me was the proposal for a northern parliament in the Arctic. It was a really ambitious vision, but it reflected a growing sense of pan-Indigenous identity and solidarity among Arctic peoples across national borders.
A parliament for the entire Arctic region. That's a bold idea.
It was, and it spoke to the desire for greater self-governance and control over their own destinies. It was also a recognition of the shared challenges they faced, particularly with the growing impacts of climate change in the Arctic.
Which is something that we're all too familiar with today. It seems like there was a lot of experimentation and innovation going on in terms of Indigenous self-governance in the early 1990s.
There was. And the idea of self-determination was taking on different forms in different contexts. In some cases, it meant pushing for greater autonomy within existing nation-states. In other cases, it meant advocating for outright independence. We see this reflected in the proposal for an Indian parliament in Ecuador, but also in other parts of Latin America.
Like the Zapatista uprising in Chiapas, Mexico, which happened just a few years later.
Exactly. And in the Pacific, there was a growing movement for decolonization. In places like Kanaki, New Caledonia, and French Polynesia, Indigenous groups were demanding greater control over their lands and resources and pushing back against French colonial rule.
So these movements weren't just about fighting against oppression. They were also about imagining and creating new possibilities for self-governance.
They were saying, we have our own ways of governing ourselves, our own systems of law and justice, and we need to be able to exercise those rights. It's a powerful message.
Okay, so we've seen how Indigenous communities were grappling with environmental threats, political repression, and the complexities of self-determination. But what about the economic side of things? What were some of the key issues around development that the yearbook highlights?
Well, one of the big themes that emerges is the tension between traditional Indigenous economies and the pressures of globalization.
That makes sense. The world was becoming increasingly interconnected back then, and those forces were surely impacting Indigenous communities.
Absolutely. Remember the Shipibo people in Peru and their remarkable system of self-sustainable development.
The ones living in harmony with nature for generations.
Yeah.
I remember.
Well, while the Shipibo offer a shining example, the yearbook also shows how many other Indigenous communities were being drawn into the global market economy, often with negative consequences.
It's like a double-edged sword, isn't it? Globalization can bring opportunities, but it can also create new challenges.
Exactly. In many cases, Indigenous communities were being forced to extract resources from their lands to generate income, even if it went against their cultural values or threatened their long-term sustainability.
It's like they were being forced to choose between preserving their way of life and participating in the global economy.
And it wasn't just about resource extraction. There were also concerns about the exploitation of Indigenous labor. The yearbook provides examples of this in industries like logging, mining, and agriculture, where Indigenous workers were often subjected to low wages, dangerous working conditions, and discrimination.
It's a reminder that economic development doesn't always benefit everyone equally.
And then there were the impacts of tourism. While tourism can bring some economic benefits to Indigenous communities, the yearbook highlights how it can also lead to the commodification of their cultures, environmental damage, and the loss of control over their lands and resources.
It's like a delicate balance, isn't it? Finding ways to benefit from tourism without sacrificing your culture or your environment.
One of the things that really fascinated me was the discussion about common property regimes and how they relate to sustainable development.
Oh, yeah, we talked about that earlier, those community-managed resources like forests, fisheries, or grazing lands.
Right. The yearbook highlights the importance of these traditional systems, which are often based on principles of collective ownership, stewardship, and respect for the natural world.
The Camp Fire program in Zimbabwe, which we discussed, was a great example of how these traditional systems could be adapted to modern conservation efforts.
It was. But the yearbook also shows how these systems are often undermined by government policies or the pressures of globalization. In many cases, governments have imposed top-down management schemes that ignore the traditional knowledge and practices of indigenous communities. This can lead to the overexploitation of resources, environmental damage, and social conflict.
So it seems like there was a growing awareness in the early 1990s of the importance of recognizing and respecting indigenous knowledge systems when it comes to development and conservation.
There was. And this wasn't just about acknowledging that indigenous knowledge is valuable. It was about recognizing that indigenous peoples have a lot to teach the world about how to live sustainably and in harmony with nature.
Which is something we desperately need today.
However, there was also a recognition that these knowledge systems were being eroded by assimilation policies, the loss of languages, and the disruption of traditional ways of life.
It's a reminder that the fight for indigenous rights is not just about legal recognition or political representation. It's also about protecting their cultures, their languages, and their knowledge systems, which are so essential to their identity and well-being.
It's about recognizing that indigenous peoples have a unique and valuable perspective on the world, a perspective that is rooted in their deep connection to the land and their long history of living sustainably.
It's a perspective that we all need to listen to, learn from, and respect.
And that brings us to a really important point, the need for solidarity and allyship in the fight for indigenous rights.
Now that you mention it, the yearbook does highlight how indigenous communities were forming alliances with other social justice movements, with environmental groups, and with human rights organizations.
They were realizing that they weren't alone in their struggles, and that by working together, they could amplify their voices and achieve greater impact. This idea of solidarity is crucial, because the fight for indigenous rights is not just about indigenous peoples. It's about creating a more just and equitable world for everyone.
It's about recognizing that we are all interconnected, and that the well-being of indigenous communities is linked to the well-being of us all.
So as we move forward from this deep dive into the past, it's important to ask ourselves, how can we be better allies to indigenous peoples in their ongoing struggles for justice and self-determination? How can we contribute to creating a world where their rights are respected, their cultures are celebrated, and their voices are heard?
Those are powerful questions, and ones we'll continue to explore in the final part of our deep dive. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the IWGIA Yearbook 1991. We've explored this pivotal moment in history, witnessing both the struggles and the remarkable resilience of indigenous peoples navigating a world trying to define sustainable development and self-determination.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? And as we wrap up, it's striking how much of what we've discussed still resonates today. Many of the challenges indigenous communities faced back in 1991 haven't disappeared. In some cases, they've even intensified.
Yeah, that's what I've been thinking too. It's sobering to realize that while progress has been made in some areas, the fight for indigenous rights is far from over.
You're absolutely right. In many parts of the world, indigenous peoples still face systemic discrimination, dispossession of their lands, and the erosion of their cultures.
The ongoing struggle over land rights is a prime example. We saw in the yearbook how central land is to indigenous identity, spirituality, and survival. Yet decades later, these communities are still fighting tooth and nail to protect their territories.
It's tragic, really. Think about the Amazon rainforest. Deforestation rates have skyrocketed in recent years, driven by this relentless push for agricultural expansion, mining, and logging. And who pays the price?
The indigenous peoples who have called the Amazon home for centuries, right?
Exactly. They're being pushed off their lands, their livelihoods are being destroyed, and their very cultures are under threat. It's a heartbreaking echo of what we saw happening in 1991.
And it's not just the Amazon. This pattern of land grabbing and displacement is happening globally. In Africa, Asia, and even here in North America, the struggle continues.
The Dakota Access Pipeline protests at Standing Rock a few years ago were a stark reminder of that.
We also can't forget that indigenous peoples are disproportionately impacted by climate change. Their traditional territories are bearing the brunt of rising sea levels, melting glaciers, extreme weather events, and shifts in plant and animal life.
The Inuit communities in the Arctic are a case in point. They're seeing their hunting and fishing grounds vanish before their eyes, their homes are threatened by coastal erosion, and their traditional knowledge systems are being disrupted by the rapidly changing environment.
It's a clear indication that we can't talk about climate justice without addressing the systemic injustices faced by Indigenous peoples. It's all interconnected.
Absolutely. And this brings us back to that crucial concept of self-determination. We saw in the yearbook how Indigenous communities were experimenting with different forms of self-governance, from local community councils to those ambitious proposals for regional parliaments.
Yeah, those were some bold ideas.
Well, those movements for self-determination are still evolving and gaining momentum today. Indigenous peoples are demanding a seat at the table, asserting their right to have a say in the decisions that affect their lives, their lands, and their futures.
It's about taking back control.
Precisely. They're calling for a shift away from top-down colonial models of governance and towards systems that recognize their inherent sovereignty and respect their traditional knowledge systems.
The movement for Indigenous-led conservation is a fantastic example of this. More and more Indigenous communities are taking the lead in protecting their territories and managing their resources, and they're doing it by drawing on their traditional knowledge and practices.
And guess what? Those practices have proven incredibly effective in preserving biodiversity and maintaining healthy ecosystems. It's not just good for Indigenous communities, it's good for the planet as a whole.
It's a win-win. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what does all this mean for us, the listeners?
It's a call to action, a reminder that we all have a role to play in supporting Indigenous rights and amplifying their voices.
And you know what's so interesting is that even small actions can make a difference. We can start by educating ourselves about the history and current realities of Indigenous peoples in our own communities and around the world.
We can support Indigenous-led organizations and initiatives both financially and by raising awareness about their work. We can engage in respectful dialogue and challenge those harmful stereotypes and prejudices whenever we encounter them.
And we can use our voices to advocate for policies that respect Indigenous rights, protect their lands, and support their self-determination.
This isn't a one-time thing, though. It's an ongoing journey that requires constant learning, reflection, and action.
The IWGIA Yearbook 1991 gave us a glimpse into a world on the cusp of change. A world where Indigenous peoples were rising up and demanding their rightful place.
And decades later, that struggle continues. It's up to all of us to ensure that their voices are heard, their rights are respected, and their cultures thrive for generations to come.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
See you next time.